The Soviet Union built entire cities that officially did not exist. Not outposts, real cities, with schools, hospitals, theaters, and tens of thousands of residents living ordinary lives. No name appeared on any map. No road sign pointed toward them. No census counted them honestly. Live inside one, and you could vanish from Soviet records entirely. Instead of a name, each city got a number, standing in for a population the state refused to acknowledge. Decades later, several of these cities are still sealed today, and at least one may still be hiding a machine built to end the world. Start with the one that shouldn't have needed secrecy at all. Sarov, in Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, had been a pilgrimage destination for nearly 300 years, built around a monastery and the memory of a monk named Seraphim, visited by pilgrims from across Russia long before the Soviet era began. Then, in 1946, the name Sarov quietly disappeared from public documents. In its place came a new designation, Arzamas 16, a number attached to a location that officially no longer existed under its old identity. The monastery grounds were repurposed for physicists, and the old pilgrimage site became the birthplace of the Soviet atomic bomb, the USSR's direct answer to America's Los Alamos. Both the first Soviet atomic bomb, tested in 1949, and the first Soviet hydrogen bomb were developed by scientists working inside this town. A place built to hold something people considered sacred was converted into a place built to hold something that could erase entire cities in seconds. That isn't a metaphor. It was the literal assignment the town was given by the state. Workers and physicists moved in permanently, cut off from friends and relatives who had no idea where they had actually gone. Letters home were censored. Even birthplaces on official documents were sometimes falsified to protect the secret. And here's the part that should feel strange. Sarov is still closed today. It remains home to VNIIEF, Russia's principal nuclear weapons research institute. Foreigners still cannot simply walk in. Special permits are still required even for ordinary Russian citizens who want to visit family living there. A city built around 3 centuries of religious pilgrimage is now guarded because of what it can destroy, not because of what it was originally meant to preserve. If Sarov hid a bomb, the next city hid the material that made bombs possible in the first place, and it paid for that secret with a poisoned landscape that still exists. Ozersk, once known only by its code name, Chelyabinsk 65, wasn't built on top of an existing settlement. It was built from nothing, using forced gulag prisoner labor, at what one Soviet official reportedly described only as Junction T, a random crossing of 2 forest footpaths with no town anywhere nearby. Within a few years, that empty crossroads held the Mayak plant, the facility responsible for producing plutonium for the entire Soviet nuclear weapons program. Construction crews built roads and housing before they even knew what the finished city would be called. In 1957, Mayak was the site of the Kyshtym disaster, one of the most severe nuclear accidents ever recorded anywhere in the world, releasing radioactive waste that contaminated a long stretch of land later known as the East Ural radioactive trace. Because the city officially did not exist on paper, for years the disaster itself barely existed either, absent from any public record and unmentioned in Soviet media. It stayed almost entirely unknown outside the Soviet Union for decades, even as thousands of people living nearby were quietly relocated away from contaminated villages, their homes bulldozed and buried along with the topsoil. Today, Ozersk residents reportedly refer to their own home as the graveyard of the earth, a phrase repeated often enough to become part of local identity. And yet, by several accounts, it remains one of the more sought-after closed cities to actually live in, prized for the wages, housing, and privileges that came bundled with the secrecy. A city built to protect a nation is now sealed off partly to contain contamination left behind by the very program it was constructed to run. Ozersk hid a disaster. The next city buried its purpose somewhere no satellite photograph could easily explain. Zheleznogorsk, formerly known as Krasnoyarsk 26, was built directly into a Siberian mountainside, its industrial core carved into solid granite. Its plutonium production reactors ran deep underground for decades, hardened against a potential attack, largely invisible from above and cooled by water pulled from the Yenisei River. That alone would make the place strange. What makes it stranger is the timeline. The Cold War that justified the facility's existence effectively ended in 1991. The reactors kept running anyway. The last graphite-moderated reactor buried inside that mountain wasn't finally shut down until 2010, nearly 20 years after the ideology that built it had already collapsed around it. A weapons-grade facility from a vanished war kept quietly producing material and generating power for a country the Soviet Union no longer even belonged to. Today, Zheleznogorsk also houses Reshetnev, one of Russia's major satellite manufacturers, producing the satellites behind the country's GLONASS navigation system, meaning a Cold War weapons city now, at least in part, helps run modern satellite-based technology instead. Zheleznogorsk remains an active, restricted city today, still central to Russia's ongoing nuclear fuel reprocessing operations, its checkpoints unchanged since Soviet times. Locals reportedly still refer to their home by its old Soviet codename in casual conversation, decades after the official name changed, as if the habit of secrecy outlived the secrecy itself. That city buried its purpose inside a mountain. The next one didn't hide a product. It hid an accident the outside world was never supposed to hear about at all. Seversk, once known as Tomsk 7, still requires visitors to pass through 6 separate manned checkpoints just to physically get inside, even now, decades after the Soviet collapse. It was built for uranium enrichment and nuclear weapons component production, one more link in a long production chain with no single name attached to any individual step of it. The city grew to house tens of thousands of workers and their families, most of whom had no way of explaining to relatives elsewhere in the country exactly what kind of work they actually did. In 1993, 2 years after the USSR itself had already dissolved, an explosion at a radiochemical facility inside Seversk released radioactive material into the surrounding area, forcing an emergency evacuation of nearby residents and contaminating a stretch of forest downwind of the plant. Time magazine later listed the incident among the world's worst nuclear disasters of the century. Soviet-style secrecy habits held even after the Soviet Union itself was gone. Initial official statements downplayed the scale of the release before more details emerged. The country that had built the secrecy protecting Seversk was already gone by the time it happened. The wall around the city and the consequences of that accident were not gone at all. These cities built weapons material. The next one never touched plutonium in any form. It was built purely to outthink a rival, and its scientists still can't leave the city without an official pass. Snezhinsk, once called Chelyabinsk 70, looks almost suburban in photographs. Ordinary apartment blocks, a park named for Lenin, wide quiet streets lined with trees. Underneath that ordinariness sits the All-Russian Scientific Research Institute of Technical Physics, one of only 2 major nuclear weapons design institutes Russia still maintains to this day. It was founded as a deliberate rival to Sarov, so that Soviet weapons design wouldn't depend on a single facility an enemy strike could eliminate in one attempt. The 2 institutes were kept intentionally separate, their scientists rarely allowed to compare notes, so a single security breach could never compromise both programs at once. For the scientists who lived there, Snezhinsk offered better food, better apartments, and better schools than most Soviet citizens ever saw. A quiet trade of freedom of movement for a genuinely comfortable life inside the wire. Multiple independent sources confirm that Snezhinsk remains closed today. Decades after the rival design bureau it was built to outpace stopped mattering. Inside a country that no longer exists in the same political form, the gates are still guarded and the checkpoints are still fully staffed. These were cities built for scientists. The next one might not really be a city built for people at all. It might be a mountain built to outlast everyone else. Mezhgorye, in the southern Urals, is home to roughly 17,000 residents, most of them connected to defense facilities built into and around Mount Yamantau. Inside that mountain sits a massive underground complex that has never been fully explained to the public in any official capacity. Officially, Russian statements issued over the years have described the site as mineral storage or an ordinary industrial facility, nothing more. Unofficially, Western analysts and journalists have speculated for decades that it could be linked to hardened continuity of government bunkers, or even to Russia's semi-automated retaliatory nuclear launch system, sometimes referred to in Western reporting as the Dead Hand. Some 1990s press reports even suggested the excavated complex could rival the physical scale of the highway loop that circles Washington, D.C., a claim the Russian government has never confirmed or seriously addressed. What is confirmed is that Mezhgorye is still closed. The excavation inside the mountain is still not open to any outside verification. And decades after the Cold War formally ended, almost nobody outside a narrow circle actually knows what sits beneath the surface. The uncertainty itself appears to have become more valuable to protect than either a confirmation or a denial ever would be. Construction there reportedly continued well after 1991, funded even during years when the Russian state could barely pay pensions elsewhere, which is its own kind of evidence about how seriously the project was taken. If Mezhgorye is a mystery the state refuses to explain, the final city is the exact opposite. Famous, filmed, celebrated on television for decades, and just as sealed as any of the others. Zheleznogorsk, Star City, near Moscow, is the most internationally recognizable of all these places, the training ground for Soviet and later Russian cosmonauts, including Yuri Gagarin himself before his historic 1961 flight. For most of its existence, it was still omitted from ordinary maps, given the exact same treatment as the weapon cities built for war rather than exploration. That's the twist worth sitting with for a moment. The optimism of the space race, arguably the most hopeful and forward-looking ambition the Soviet Union ever publicly pursued, sat behind the exact same secrecy fences as the bomb factories hiding plutonium and warheads. A camp built to send people further into the open sky than anyone before them has, for most of its history, also been one of the more closed-off, restricted spots on the entire map of the country. It still functions today as Russia's primary cosmonaut training center, still a restricted settlement requiring clearance, occasionally opened only for specific joint training arrangements with international partner space agencies whose astronauts have trained there for missions to the International Space Station. Even now, a visiting foreign astronaut typically needs sponsorship and advance clearance simply to walk through gates that, decades earlier, were meant to hide the exact same program the world eventually celebrated. From bombs to mountains to space heroes, the official map avoided every single one of them. Not because any of them failed at their purpose, but because, in their own strange way, most of them worked exactly as intended for decades on end. That is what actually separates these cities from the ruins and failed utopias people usually associate with abandoned Soviet ambition elsewhere across the old empire. These weren't broken dreams left to rot out in the open air for tourists to wander through later. Most of these cities succeeded at precisely what they were built for, which is arguably a far stranger idea than simple failure would have been. Secrecy here was never a symptom of collapse. It was the price of ongoing success, paid continuously, year after year, long after the government that first demanded it had already stopped existing in any recognizable form. A state can erase a city from official reality while that same city keeps thriving quietly behind its own fence, producing exactly what it was designed to produce for far longer than the ideology that originally ordered it into being. There are still reportedly close to 40 of these closed cities across Russia today, some publicly acknowledged, some not. Together holding well over 1 million residents who live under rules the rest of the country does not. Every one of these places is, in its own particular way, a record of what the Soviet state believed genuinely mattered enough to hide completely from its own citizens. A bomb, the material for a bomb, a mountain full of buried reactors, a covered-up accident, a rival design bureau, a possible doomsday bunker, and a training ground for heroes who were publicly meant to represent the very opposite of secrecy. Put side by side, they form a rough map of Soviet fear and ambition at the same time. A map the state itself refused to draw honestly. At Seversk, there are still 6 checkpoints standing today. Guards still check documents at each one, decades after the empire that built that wall stopped existing in any political form whatsoever. The regime collapsed. The ideology that justified it collapsed along with it. The fences did not collapse. The silence did not collapse either. Somewhere behind one of them, ordinary apartment lights still switch on every evening in a city most of the country was never told existed, and in some cases still isn't. A number that was never meant to become a name again is still, as far as anyone outside can confirm with certainty, not on the map.